been a lot of talk about increasing IRS enforcement to bring in more money to the government. That'd be fine if we could trust the IRS to keep taxpayers' information safe and secure and actually using that information to enforce the tax code. Now, unfortunately, that notion is waffling on pretty shaky ground at this very moment. In June, the nonprofit journalism webpage, ProPublica, began publishing stories that appear to contain confidential taxpayer information that might have come from the IRS. Unfortunately, attention has focused more on the private tax affairs of the victims of these actions than on the apparently illegal actions taken to produce the data that forms the basis of these ProPublica stories. By law, the confidentiality of taxpayers' information is sacrosanct. That comes from Section 6103 of the tax code, a section that was put in law in the 1970s, I believe, to see that what Nixon did to use the IRS to go after his enemies never happened again. So why is this information sacrosanct? Because a federal income tax return contains some of the most sensitive information that there is about our fellow Americans. A tax return is essentially a blueprint for how families and individuals live their lives. Aside from detailing where and how taxpayers support themselves and earn money, tax returns potentially detail what charities, including even religious institutions, that a taxpayer supports. Tax returns can also detail where and how they take care of their children, their medical status, and lots of other deeply personal information. In part, to protect tax compliance, Congress decided that in exchange for collecting sensitive information needed to enforce the Internal Revenue Code, the IRS must treat this information carefully and protect it from unauthorized access and disclosure. That's what Section 6103 is all about. And it carries with it significant criminal and civil penalties for any violations of those terms. Nevertheless, the ProPublica stories published in a series entitled, quote, "The Secret IRS Files Inside the Tax Returns of the 0.001%, are plainly derived," that's the end of the quote, "but these are plainly derived from the confidential taxpayers' information." The folks in charge of enforcing the tax code quickly recognized that they had a big problem here. That very morning, the IRS Commissioner Reddick was testifying before the Senate Finance Committee and said that he appreciated the confidential nature of the information collected by the IRS and how very important it is that people are able to trust the IRS with that information. Commissioner Reddick isn't the only Treasury official to express that concern. When asked about this apparent abuse of taxpayer information at the Finance Committee hearing on the President's fiscal 2022 budget request held on June the 16th, Treasury Secretary Yellen said she agreed the situation was very serious and that the matter has been referred to the Justice Department. The week before, appearing before a different Senate committee, Attorney General Garland also said this was a very serious matter and that people are entitled to the privacy regarding their tax information. I agree with Commissioner Reddick, Secretary Yellen, and General Garland that the apparent leak of confidential information is a very serious issue. For one thing, we don't know exactly where the information came from. Was it a leak? Was it a hack? We don't seem to know. We also don't know the full scope of the information at risk. According to ProPublica, it has, quote, obtained a vast trove of Internal Revenue Service data on the tax returns of thousands of the nation's wealthiest people, covering more than 15 years, end of quote. So let me say that again. ProPublica claims that it has thousands of tax returns. Americans know the risk of having their private information unsecured in the wind. They know the risk, for example, of fraud and identity theft. And of course, Nixon's political enemies knew the risk of letting the IRS run loose. According to the most recent IRS Electronic Tax Information Advisory Committee annual report to Congress issued in June of 2021, 185,000 identity theft affidavits were filed with the IRS in 2020. The report also notes that due to pandemic relief, higher levels of identity theft are expected during the 2021 filing season. Sure, in this case, ProPublica has decided that the wealthiest individuals are the ones worth targeting. But again, we don't know the full scope of the information that is at risk. Maybe you're not the owner of a sports team or the head of a multinational company or haven't built a vehicle in which you have recently traveled to outer space. The unauthorized access and disclosure of taxpayer information should be a concern to all taxpayers. If someone can expose the most private and sensitive information of the nation's wealthiest citizens, they can do it to anyone. Regardless of what anyone thinks about the known victims of this disclosure, no one should be absolutely confident that their information hasn't been compromised. As soon as the apparent disclosure of taxpayer information was known, I pressed authorities in the executive branch to take action. I questioned Commissioner Reddick about it during the Finance Committee that very day. 3 days later, I sent a letter to Leader McConnell and Finance Ranking Member Crapo. I sent this letter with those two individuals to Attorney General Garland and FBI Director Christopher Wray, asking them to take action on this very important matter. In part, the letter reads, quote, "Find those responsible for these disclosures and ensure they're punished as directed by law. Unless you do, ordinary Americans will fall victim to these politicized and criminal disclosures, and trust in the IRS and our tax system will continue to erode." That's end of quote by the letter that I sent with Leader McConnell and Finance Chairman Ranking Member Crapo. On the same day, I joined every other Republican on the Finance Committee on a letter to the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration asking for an immediate investigation. Following Treasury Secretary Yellen's June 16th appearance before the Finance Committee, I also submitted several questions to her in writing. My questions ask pretty simple questions about the scope of the leak and the hack, and whether or not anyone with advanced knowledge of the first ProPublica piece had reached out to the Treasury or to the IRS. On June the 16th, I sent a letter to the Attorney General Garland and FBI Director Wray with other Judiciary Committee Republicans seeking a briefing and a confirmation that the FBI or the Department of Justice is investigating. Now, as usual, I have not received a single response to any of my written inquiries. There appears to be a massive flaw somewhere in our system of tax administration. Our job, through constitutional oversight, is to determine exactly what the situation is, how it happened, and how we can fix it. Unfortunately, it appears some are using the apparent illegal disclosure of taxpayer information and the violation of taxpayers' rights to advance a partisan agenda. That probably doesn't surprise a lot of people, that politics would be involved in this. It's important to note that the ProPublica pieces aren't talking about tax evasion, but generally tax avoidance, which is a legal minimization of taxes owed. On June 24th, ProPublica published a story about Roth IRAs using the information of a wealthy tech investor. The purpose of this story was to show that this investor, quote, and other ultra-wealthy investors have used them to amass vast untaxed fortunes, end of quote. The next day, on June 25th, ProPublica published a story highlighting a senior Democratic senator's legislation intended to crack down on large Roth IRAs accounts, the same type of account criticized in the previous day's articles. And you're talking about abuse of Roth IRAs? It's in the law. A different ProPublica story seemed intended to wield private taxpayer information to affect the outcome of an election. Now listen to this. On June the 16th, ProPublica published a story containing taxpayer information of a candidate in the Democratic primary to be the next district attorney of Manhattan. Seems to me like somebody's using political things to hurt people in their own political party. Given how concerned many of my colleagues have been about potential election interference, I'm really very shocked that this story completely missed their attention. If a candidate's confidential, legally protected information is somehow disclosed less than a week before an election, especially when we don't know the ultimate source of the confidential information or how it was even obtained, shouldn't that raise a red flag to a lot of people in this town? Or does it only matter depending upon who the candidate is? Finally, I want to address ProPublica's role in this situation. Although they may be very well-intentioned, in my opinion, they're facilitating an abuse of power by publishing stolen, confidential information of individual citizens who are, by all appearances, complying with their legal obligations. They think they're informing the public of information they need to know. They're really telling the public that their tax return information is not private. They could have serious consequences for the proper administration of our tax laws that are based on the proposition that people are going to give honest, correct information because they know it's going to be public and because they owe taxes and they're honest people. Plainly, this isn't about tax cheats who broke the law. It's about certain people not paying what ProPublica thinks they should pay, regardless if they're paying every dollar that the law requires that they pay. So it's really about promoting changes to tax law that ProPublica and certain members of this body would support. The identity of specific taxpayers that we know have had their information violated is not an excuse. The notion that taxpayers' information, every taxpayer's information, should be protected is not a view only held by this senator. I've quoted Treasury Secretary, I've quoted the Attorney General, all holding that same view. The use of this information to advance partisan objectives and apparently to influence an election should concern all of us. We need to get to the bottom of what happened. We need to know what taxpayer information is at risk, how many taxpayers have been compromised, and then determine what we can do going forward. So I implore Secretary Yellen and Attorney General Garland to respond to my questions and my letters so that we can get on with our very important work. I yield the floor, and I